to fight the pandemic. Windsor Johnston, NPR News, Washington.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's announced the annexation of 4 territories from Ukraine. Here's NPR's Charles Maines.
In a defiant speech at the Kremlin's St. George Hall, President Putin proclaimed the territories of Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson formally and now forever part of the Russian Federation. Western nations and the UN have denounced the Russian annexation move and the staged referendums in Ukraine that preceded it as illegal. Some of the territory Moscow now claims is only partially held by Russian forces. Yet in his address, Putin took aim at the West for writing the rules that dictate who has a right to self-determination. The Russian leader also framed the Kremlin standoff with the West over Ukraine as part of a wider battle over political and cultural sovereignty. Charles Maines, NPR News, Moscow.
It's NPR.
This is KUOW News. I'm Kevin Kniested in Seattle. The bodies of some of the victims from this month's float plane crash off Woodby Island have been recovered, along with most of the wreckage. Crews were able to lift 80% of the plane from the water yesterday and say it will take a few more days to recover the rest. 9 adults and 1 child died in the September 4th crash. Here's Jennifer Hamady with the National Transportation Safety Board.
Yeah, so we'll move the wreckage to a secure location, and different teams will come here to begin documenting the wreckage and doing a thorough analysis. Plus, we've requested a number of documents, both from the FAA, from the operator itself, and we'll begin delving through those as well. And that will take some time.
In fact, the NTSB says it could take between 1 to 2 years to determine exactly why the plane went down. It had been inspected 3 days before the crash and had completed a trip earlier that same day, but it was not equipped, nor was it required to be equipped with a flight data recorder or cockpit voice recorder. Maybe fall, but we've got another warm, dry weekend on the way. And while that's great for endless summer fans, Dana Felton with the National Weather Service says that will leave us at serious risk of more wildfires.
Here in the lowlands, we're extremely dry. We had a record dry summer. Just want to have folks keep in mind that it's not going to take much to start a fire. Things could light up pretty fast.
Felton is urging people to be careful and don't do anything that could spark a fire. As for the Bolt Creek fire, it's still 13% contained, but all evacuation orders for people being affected by the fire have now been dropped to level 1. And Highway 2 is back open around Skykomish and Stevens Pass. And when it comes to La Nina, which is on the way, Felton says it's likely to arrive late. In the meantime, Seattle could experience its warmest first week of October on record, with highs around 80 degrees. This is KUOW News.
From NPR stations. Other contributors include Progressive Insurance with its Name Your Price tool, a way to see coverage options based on a driver's budget. Learn more at progressive.com or 1-800-PROGRESSIVE. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Welcome to Friday. Welcome to KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. I thank you for giving us 1 hour to catch you up on what happened this week. And by we, I'm talking about Seattle Times environment reporter Isabella Breda. Hi, Isabella.
Hey, happy to be here.
Nice to see you here. Crosscut Central and Eastern Washington reporter Hoang is not in Central or Eastern Washington. Great to have you here.
Thanks. It's good to be here for the first time.
Yeah. And Seattle Channel host and producer Brian Callanan is in Seattle.
Yeah. Great to be in studio with you here, Bill. This is great.
Great to see you too, Brian. And you can see us too. We just might not always be looking at you, but we're streaming the show on YouTube and on Facebook as usual. Just search KUOW Public Radio. And if you missed any part of the show, you can hear the whole thing on the Week in Review podcast or on KUOW.org. Okay, let's start the show with what might be a quick thing, a quick item here. I just saw this last night. The last time you were on this program, we laughed about how every time you're a guest, you must discuss deleted texts on every show.
I feel like it's been like 3 or 4 shows now.
Yeah. We laughed about it on the last show. You can go back and hear that show, except sadly, it's no longer available. Somebody has deleted the.
Right. Wait for it.
Okay. Wait for it.
Yep.
Okay. I see what you did there.
Once again. So serious news item, like the background is quite serious, right? The summer of 2020, heated protests, police tear gassing Black Lives Matter protesters, police abandoned their precinct building on Capitol Hill, demonstrators take over part of that neighborhood. People were shot, 2 people died, there was damage to businesses, and some businesses and residents are suing the city over their actions. but lawsuits require evidence, and thousands of text messages sent around that time and afterward by the mayor, the police chief, the fire chief, they've disappeared. So the update is that NBC News is now reporting that 191 texts were manually deleted from Mayor Jenny Durkin's phone. Brian, what is the significance of manually deleted?
I think this turns from, at least from the plaintiff's point of view, a sin of omission to a sin of commission. So I think the story we've been hearing from Jenny Durkin all along has been, I was out at my place out on Puget Sound and dropped my phone in the water. And then in the process of restoring it, the settings were switched such that it was deleting text in a way that it should not have, right? So what we're hearing now from the plaintiffs is that, guess what? 191 texts were actually manually deleted. That's different than settings, having the settings changed or whatever else. That's actually going in and deleting these things. So I'm really interested in this because it came out with the lawsuit that the Seattle Times filed against Jenny Durkin with the Public Records Act. And that was settled earlier this year. And in that settlement, Jenny Durkin admitted, well, this happened with my phone in the water and all that, but it was in my possession the entire time. No one else could have touched it. So that's a very interesting piece of this. I don't know how this is all going to come together from a court perspective, but you have a lot of merchants up there who are suing the city for millions of dollars. You've got these concerns about public records too. So this does not look good, I don't think, for Jenny Durkin, but we'll have to see how it plays out in court.
Does anyone know whether this is just about the odds of someone getting a settlement from the city of Seattle versus Jenny Durkin personally being in jeopardy here?
Well, didn't I see on top of that there were city staffers that also had restored their phones?
Yes.
So it goes far beyond just the former mayor.
Yes, thank you. This report, I keep wanting to say it like it's not an autopsy. When you go, I don't know what the right word. Forensic report.
There you go.
Thank you. Thank you. This forensic report says that factory resets were performed on the phones of 6 other city officials in the fall of 2020, resulting in thousands of messages being deleted. And the city said, that's because the officials had forgotten passwords or otherwise locked themselves out of their devices.
Sounds suspicious.
Yeah.
I mean, when's the last time you did a factory reset on your phone?
That's,
No,
I mean,
I
just put in a big bowl of rice. I mean, isn't that what you're supposed to do?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like, the story just keeps changing. I feel like I've heard, because I've been on the show and we keep talking about it, I feel like I hear like a different version, like every show.
Yes.
So probably the next time on the show, it'll be like a different version.
Well, we'll have to time that just right.
Excited to hear about it.
Okay. So does that about cover it for now? If you're following,
I think so. I think it's
case.
just an issue of following this court case, see what happens with these different merchants and their lawsuit, but also looking at what this means in the long term. Because again, with looking back at the Times lawsuit, Seattle is trying to change its habits when it comes to this and how public officials save their messages. So they, from what I understand, they have, but it hasn't really been tested, and it only really does get tested when lawsuits get filed. So that's what we're up against here.
Right. Okay. So that's the former mayor, among other people, as we've said, several other people. Let's talk about the new mayor of Seattle, who's so new that he hadn't written the budget before this week. And as Marcus Harrison Green wrote in the Times, a Seattle budget is a reflection of Seattle's beliefs. So let's hear a bit of the speech from Mayor Bruce Harrell.
We also know that evaluating and expanding how we respond to emergencies and to crime will improve our safety outcomes. Our Parks District proposal reestablishes the Park Ranger program, which would reduce the need for police to visit parks. And this budget puts nearly $2 million toward programs to explore and diversify 911 responses. We know that just sending police officers to a scene is not always the right approach. We recognize this. This is how we will begin to build more options. We are working hard to stand up a third public safety department, strategically deployed hand in hand with fire, hand in hand with police, to help community members in their moments of need. Now, this investment will provide critical insight to further inform that effort as we aim to be bold and diversify our approach to public safety. So as we continue to work together to develop a more effective public safety system, I'm proposing returning the parking enforcement officers from SDOT, from the Seattle Department of Transportation, back to SPD. Now, having heard from our employees, the PEOs and their labor representatives, we understand that our PEOs feel better equipped to do their work from SPD at this time. So we all should recognize that the PEO's office, their space, their human resources, their IT resources, their equipment are all currently still located within SPD. So while we continue our work to reimagine public safety, this may not be our PEO's final home. However, this move will avert nearly $5 million in general fund costs that can be applied towards important community investments.
Brian, is Seattle's mayor refunding the police?
Not exactly. I
Okay.
think at least with these parking enforcement officers, if I can start there, this was something that just didn't go well. This was something that happened at the end of last year. The city council, again, trying to reimagine police and where we put assets. So they wanted to move these parking enforcement officers who weren't chasing after crime, et cetera, outside of the Seattle PD. And originally, they wanted to have them in the new communications center, the new agency that the city has set up. That's what the public safety chair, Lisa Herbold, was pushing for. Some of her compatriots on the council said, no, let's put them into SDOT. It didn't work out
That's
well.
the transportation department.
SDOT, you got it, Seattle Department of Transportation. And so with that move, it didn't work out well. You might remember from earlier this year, reported by David Croman in the Seattle Times, that the problem was the authority to write tickets was not transferred over with this transfer department. So hundreds of thousands of tickets had to be refunded to different people who got them because of this shift. So I will say, though, this is a situation where I think Mayor Harrell went to pains to say, this is what we're doing right now. That's not to say that PEOs, these parking enforcement officers, couldn't move into a different agency, but for the right here and right now, they wanted to make sure they had something that was stable. I think in the future, there's definitely going to be some pressure from the city council to move these parking enforcement officers out. But right now, putting them back into SPD seemed like the smartest move. And so that's what the mayor did.
Okay, I know this sounds like a small point, but I didn't understand. He says that this might not be permanent. Parking enforcement might move back again, but this is going to save $5 million. So I don't see how moving them again later saves $5 million or anything. You're nodding your head, Isabella. It's not just me.
Well, I just feel like there was a lot of background provided on why this was happening, and maybe it was just a political move to say this makes more sense right now, but there wasn't a lot of explanation as to why it would be saving any money.
$5 million in efficiency of having them in the same office. I'm not quite sure either, Isabella, but I think this is certainly on behalf of the mayor trying to be very frank about not defunding the police. He doesn't want to do that. So he's trying to restore these different parts here. But I think he's also looking at what the city council was looking at last year, which was this report from the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. You'll hear it being named Nick Jr. by the city council there. They had this report that showed 80% of the calls that police are going to are actually non-criminal calls. So there is a push. There's definitely a push to try to move some of these different functions that are not criminal related, that are not investigation related, out of the Seattle Police Department. The council thought they had something going with this situation with the PEOs. It didn't work out, but I think that is going to be part of the discussion over the next couple of years here. And as the mayor brought up there, he is looking into building this third agency here, this third emergency agency. And I think that's going to be something that we see over the next couple of months, and certainly at the start of next year.
Okay, he mentioned park rangers.
Yeah.
Some progressive Seattle groups say they oppose more park rangers. This is Angelica Chasero with the group Decriminalize Seattle, calling park rangers soft cops.
When we say defund SPD and fund community needs, we do not mean fund responders who may not be armed, but who will also act to funnel people into jail or into other coercive settings.
Will these park rangers funnel people into jail or other coercive settings?
Not from the city council's perspective. So this was all part of the Parks District budget that's been worked on over the past couple of weeks here. It's going to be doubled.
It's going up.
Yeah, it is. It is going to be doubled there. And so that's something that Seattle voters and taxpayers need to be aware of there. But essentially, in passing this, the council put a resolution within this package that said, all right, you know what? We figured this out back in 2012. These park rangers are not about making arrests. They make verbal recommendations, if you will, to people. It's like, hey, sleeping here is probably not a good idea. Or, you really need to.
They can't say, hey, you cannot sleep here.
It's not. It's less of a. I guess it's less of a push and more of a pull is the way I'd look at it. And so I think they're just they're out there to provide a presence. It is not a police officer. It's not an armed officer. But specifically, what the council said in its resolution in passing this through was, okay, these park rangers cannot be part of anything resembling a sweep of people who are homeless. So they're trying to be very specific about that. I'm hopeful that that's the way it'll actually turn out. But I think when you hear these different protesters here and what they're saying, I think there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on these park rangers as they get 27 of them now are going to be deployed around mainly downtown areas.
Yeah. Okay. Any more information or questions about Seattle budget? Feel like we covered it enough for now? Okay.
Lot going on.
Okay. Well, I want to move then to King County, which wants a new property tax levy to raise $1.25 billion over 9 years for mental health care and substance use treatment. Right now, King County doesn't have any walk-in centers for people in a behavioral health crisis. This week, the county executive said he wants to open 5 community crisis centers across the county. No word yet on where those would be. Some indicators, but we don't know yet where these 5 crisis centers would be. This is County Council member Gurmai Zahalai, who is among the supporters of this bill.
For a region of 2.3 million people, we have 1 crisis care facility with 46 beds, and you need a first responder referral to get into it. And if you want a walk-in place, a voluntary place that you can go to get care, you have 0 options.
This levy money would also reopen 100 treatment beds in the county that have closed in the last 5 years. The levy would cost about $10 a month for the owner of a median valued home, and it could be on the ballot as soon as April. Is there any opposition to this? I guess we'll see what the voters say in April, but where are there serious arguments pro and con? What should listeners know about this question of whether to pay for more property taxes to build mental health crisis centers?
Something that stood out to me was the crisis counselor that spoke at the press conference and basically said, we feel undervalued, and how are you going to employ people and open these centers if we don't have more pay? And that was specifically something that was outlined there, that the money could be used to help recruit people to work in that field. I mean, I think that's something that's felt across the healthcare sector, but especially in behavioral health lately.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of mentioning, like, basically it's hard to get help. I mean, even for a person that's well off, has insurance. I hear my, colleagues and other professionals have a hard time getting like a therapist appointment. So think about people who need these crisis centers. They're probably they don't have those same resources. So, I mean, there's definitely a need.
And if you're showing up to a crisis center and getting turned away, what happens next? Who's there to care for that person?
Right. It's just kind of this inverse. It's ridiculous to see the amount of different problems with mental health, behavioral health that have grown exponentially during the pandemic here, and yet by the same token, as we've seen prices go up, et cetera, it's more and more difficult to get mental health professionals to do the job. They've been leaving in droves. And so I think those are the 2 pieces that the county is trying to work on here. In terms of the no side of this, if you will, I think there are a lot of people, I mentioned that Seattle Parks District piece is doubling. The King County Conservation Futures Fund, that looks like it's going to be doubling too. That's on the ballot this November. So I think there is some concern about rising taxes that's out there. You'll definitely hear that pushback from a lot of different people. But I will say Seattle and King County have a pretty solid history of supporting a lot of levies. So I would think that would happen again here. But again, we're going to have to see what happens with this in April. A lot of time in between then and now.
Yeah, the city council member Alex Peterson told the Seattle Times that constituents are complaining about tax bills. The Times Editorial Board said the city needs to get its financial house in order before they ask for more money. But as you say, voters usually just keep saying, yes, we want to be taxed.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's the way our state works. And you've probably heard it before from lawmakers of any stripe. They will tell you that we have the most regressive tax system in the country. And so how do you deal with that? Well, the way we
remind people what regressive tax structure is.
It means that people who earn a lot of money have a certain amount of tax taken from them, but the people who earn a lot less money, the percentage of their money that is taken away is a lot more, if that makes sense. Yeah. So yes, that's what we're talking about with regressive here. And because we base most of our taxes on property taxes, we don't have an income tax in our state, right? And so that turns into a situation where property tax is just about one of the very few ways that lawmakers can actually reach out and get revenue. And so what they're doing with a lot of these different measures is they're bumping up that amount that they're able to collect, but they need to keep under that 1% threshold there. So it turns into a challenge, if you want to look at it that way, from a lawmaker's perspective about how much they can gain, but it can turn into a challenge for taxpayers too. I don't think you can overlook that. And I think Councilmember Peterson has been talking about that a lot on the Seattle City Council, because there's other stuff coming up like the Move Seattle levy in a little while. We're talking about the housing levy next year. So there's a lot of things at work here. I don't have a perfect answer to it, but I know that's what lawmakers are dealing with.
Yeah. You think voters would say yes to lifting the lid on property taxes or changing the state constitution to allow an income tax if they can't get one through the courts, or get a capital gains tax through the courts?
It's in the works. I know that lawmakers have been looking at a billionaire's tax over the past couple of years, a wealth tax, things of that nature. Income tax has been a non-starter for the most part, but who knows? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends where you are. I mean, where, I think on the opposite side, I'm in Eastern Washington, and a lot of communities, not just in Eastern Washington, actually, a lot of communities in like Southwest Washington have been passing these laws like, no, we're not going to put in a city income tax. So, I mean, there's definitely a push in the opposite direction as well. So it depends where you are. I think people are kind of flirting with it. I mean, they're looking at different, if you can't pass a quote unquote income tax, pass all these other types of taxes and then see how people react.
Right. Like the jumpstart payroll tax here in Seattle is an example too. So there's different avenues that lawmakers can take, but they're pretty limited.
Yeah, I would say the concern, because actually we talked about the jumpstart tax, I think the last time I was on the show. So
watch out.
Yeah.
There are rules, Mike.
That's right.
Rules.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, and I think the concern with that tax was, the point of that was affordable housing.
Yes.
But they were actually using some of it for like general fund stuff. So
a lot of COVID relief just to kind of keep the budget rolling there. But you're right. Affordable housing is where it's supposed to be going.
So, I mean, and I think during that show, I talked about, that builds distrust among taxpayers if you need to be transparent. I read in a lot of I read an op-ed, and it was talking about like nationally, not just Seattle, but they're talking about how you need to rebuild, Democrats need to rebuild the trust and be transparent about like what these taxes are used for, because like Republicans are going to exploit that and say, well, look how they like used your money and they didn't use it properly.
And rural communities, especially in like Snohomish County, where I had covered for a long time, will push back on that and use that as an example. If this is what you did with my property taxes the last time and it's not going the way I want it to, I'm not going to pass this next school district levy. I'm not going to pass this 0.01% tax for affordable housing. I want to see what's happening with it. So you can't just keep relying on that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Isabella, I know Snohomish County's got to be changing between my in-migration from other places, including the city of Seattle. Where is Snohomish County these days on sort of these conservative, progressive stands, taxes, other things? Has it changed a lot since you came there?
I would say it's still a mixed bag. I mean, Everett still remains pretty progressive and willing to pass taxes, regardless on whether or not they had a belief on whether previous taxes function the way they had intended to. But then when you look at smaller communities and you especially go out east, even Index, which the Seattle Times reported that there's this big influx of like climbers moving out there since they've had the opportunity to work remotely. Even those communities remain pretty anti-tax. So
even after a big fire?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we're not, in a way, there's a theme to this show because, the limits, what limits there should be on COVID relief and clean energy programs, that's all going to come up here on Week in Review after we take a short break, and we're going to come right back to the show with Seattle Channel's Brian Callanan and Crosscut's Hoang, the Seattle Times Isabella Breda. We're all on YouTube and Facebook with you. Search KUOW Public Radio. We'll be right back.
.949 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:27. Our forecast is for sun this afternoon and a high of 67.
Hey, my name is Brandy Fullwood, and I'm a producer here at KUOW for Seattle Now. Every weekday morning at 6, our team of producers and journalists get you the stories you need to know in our region, and all in 15 minutes or less. We'll help you understand what's really going on in Seattle and what it all means to you. And in case you're not an early riser, that's okay. You can always listen and subscribe to the Seattle Now podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Support for KUOW comes from Sound, a behavioral health provider treating youth to older adults in multiple locations region-wide. With greater need, Sound is seeking dedicated team members committed to improving lives in the community and acknowledging National Recovery Month. More at sound.health/careers.
This is KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke. School superintendents across Washington state say they need more time to spend federal COVID relief money before it gets cut off. One of my guests here, Mai Hoang, is with Crosscut, and this story comes from your colleagues. What is the federal COVID tax relief money supposed to be spent on for schools?
Yeah, you can probably guess what, the main drives the lost academic progress. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that not being in school for several years, a lot of kids are falling behind, so they're trying to get kids to catch up.
Like remedial work or more teachers?
Yeah, and then the other thing I think that people might not know about is air filtration, like trying to improve. One of the things that kind of came out of COVID and the conversation is just that, the filtration system, the air in these schools aren't very good. So, that's an opportunity to use that. And then mental health. I mean, we just talked about in the previous segment. I mean, kids really have been impacted mentally in terms with mental health issues. I actually know people personally who had kids that really went through it during COVID. So
yeah, we saw those healthy youth surveys during the pandemic years, 2020 and 2021, that came back with students reporting, increasing symptoms of anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts. And so that was something that I think educators really wanted to focus on and how to spend those relief dollars.
Yeah, my kids, I love them pieces, and they just went through a lot during COVID and in high school, both of them. And I just think it's been a difficult thing for kids to deal with, and resiliency. We always talk about that, and kids are very much resilient, but there's a limit to that. And I think that's a big piece of this when it comes to mental and behavioral health.
Yeah, ditto. We were watching, that movie Encanto.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about Bruno. And there's another song in there we like about the pressure that the
big sister,
the Hercules sister faces. It's all about feeling pressure. Mm-hmm. And my oldest just burst into tears watching it. I said, "What, honey, what's going on?" And she just said, that I so relate to that feeling of pressure. And you can't put all that on a pandemic, but yeah, anyway, get emotional there. So meanwhile, here we are, Congress approved this in 3 different rounds, federal COVID tax relief money. Congress said that it was to help schools navigate immediate coronavirus related challenges. And they did give it a cutoff, 2025. The president said the pandemic's over. What's the argument for keeping the money flowing past 2025?
I mean, I think they're still unpacking. I mean, if you read the story my colleagues wrote, I mean, it's clear these school districts are still kind of trying to figure out what the impact. I mean, there's kind of the immediate idea, like we know the basic idea, which is, there's learning loss. We know there was mental health issues, but we don't know. I think what they're trying to figure out is what is the extent of those issues, and then how do we fix those issues? And then obviously these are issues that aren't going to go away just because the pandemic's over. So how do we sustain, that care beyond, the quote unquote pandemic?
Right. And the year 2025, it just kind of turns into a little bit of a cliff. So it's like we're providing the services and not so much anymore. So I think a few schools are looking at that and trying to find ways to extend this money out, because I think, like you say, these services are still going to be very much needed, and not every school has the resources to put towards them on a consistent basis. And this federal money has helped a lot, but I think, as you say, they are still unpacking what's going on with these students and teachers.
And if you look at other COVID relief programs that kind of just ended, like I think the one I think about is like the eviction moratoriums. Those just kind of ended, and then all of a sudden, all these like housing advocates are like running around being like, okay, like, and they didn't offer rent assistance. So now we're like, that's why you had all these rent assistance programs come at the last minute, because everyone was. So I think the school districts are trying to prevent this cliff where they're having to kind of run around and like figure out on the fly, like what to do next.
Well, if Congress members vote on a package with a deadline, can the White House, can the administration then just remove the deadline? Or, I mean, maybe if the pandemic worsens again, as we keep being warned about, maybe Congress reconsiders the deadline, or maybe these school systems can drum up more money from the legislature.
I mean, all those options are on the table. I mean, I think it depends on, it depends on political will. And, I kind of shared a link with you guys before the show about, that Republicans are saying, oh, well, they're actually using this money to put in like leftist, racially charged programming. So this is why they're not using it for COVID. Like that's the argument. And, and kind of the school districts are also, at the end of the story that my colleagues wrote, you have a quote from a superintendent saying, oh, actually, we're still having problems, even with McCleary, McCleary. Right.
McCleary was the court decision that said Washington State needs to fund schools as job one.
So and they still haven't really figured that out yet. So they're trying to figure out that. And so they're saying this is an opportunity for us to figure that out too. And so I can see some people being like, well, that's not COVID, that's not relevant. I mean, it is kind of relevant. They're intertwined, but I could see the argument of people saying it's not. So,
and I think what you're getting at too is like, it's not just necessarily COVID resiliency and recovery. It's also schools addressing things like we've never had a suite of mental health supports. And maybe that's
before
something
COVID, we didn't have it.
Yeah. And maybe that's something that we need. And it takes time to develop a program. And that may not necessarily happen before the spending window closes. So they're grappling with all these different issues and ideas.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like they're throwing, like as a state, I mean, I think in a couple of shows we've talked about the new new law that allows kids to stay home for mental health. That's new. I mean, they're throwing a lot of things out there and are experimenting with a lot. And so, this COVID money is useful for those types of things. But again, like they're still trying to figure out how to make it work. And so I think they're trying to the state. I mean, there is a website that OSPI has that shows like, here's all the objectives, here's how we want to spend the money. And they actually have given some extryexamples of different school districts and what they have done with the money. So just because they haven't like rushed and spent the money doesn't mean they're not using it. It's just that they're trying to be thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it looks like these individual districts can actually file some paperwork to extend it by a year and a half. So I imagine a few of them will do that, but that is a process they would have to go through. So I'm interested to see how that plays out. And just in terms of how our state funds schools, I think you're absolutely right, Maya and Isabella. This is something that really lays bare that challenge that, there we had that McCleary decision in 2012. Then the legislature came up with a few fixes in 2018. And I think we're still there in that situation where schools that are in rich districts, they have more resources. They have more things going on for students. And families. Yeah, they pass levies, right. And these other communities do not. Snohomish County is one of them, sure.
Okay, well, whether or not you think we're still in a pandemic emergency, here's a crisis that everybody agrees is building, Isabella. You are now on the environment beat for the Seattle Times, and Seattle has now begun its own version of the Green New Deal. What does that mean in Seattle?
Yeah, so it's been in the works since 2019 when they were one of, dozens of cities across the country that passed a resolution committing to these very ambitious climate goals. Some of them, just making transit free and accessible, expanding routes. Some days it's hard to see that being a functioning thing when light rail, the power is out 5 stops along the way. So there's just little things, and it's going to take multiple agencies teaming up to be able to reach those goals. One thing that sticks out is where Seattle is on its carbon neutral goals. So for one, it would be, being carbon neutral from city buildings and I believe vehicles as well by 2035. And what that's going to take is, replacing entire fleets of vehicles, transitioning all the buildings, some of them built eons ago, to clean, quote unquote, clean power. So electric heat pumps and those types of things. And those all come at a cost. So once again, you're going to be looking at what the taxpayers are willing to front. Granted, the first piece of this that rolled out last week was $6.5 million for just a handful of programs chipping away at these Green New Deal goals. And it's going to take a lot more than that to get to where they want to be by 2035.
Yeah, there's a lot going on with this. And I just thought it was very interesting to unpack it last week with what the mayor was talking about. He spoke down in the Duwamish Valley about this. And I thought that was very telling because we talk about the cost of it financially. There are costs to it in terms of human life in that area of Seattle there, Duwamish Valley, the lifespan is 8 years less than the rest of the neighborhoods around Seattle. So I think they're looking back at the events like the heat dome we had a short while ago. Number of people died here in the city of Seattle. It was the most deaths we've ever had from a weather-related event in Washington state. So I think there's definitely some concerns about costs, and, the market not jumping on here very quickly. That's a piece of it for sure, but there are human costs too. I just wanted to make sure I brought that up as well.
Sure. And that was something that was discussed at that press conference there in the Duwamish Valley was overhead, there's planes flying every 30 or less seconds. And that's something that people from the Green New Deal Oversight Board, like Maria Batayola, spoke about. Kids who can't focus in schools in the area. It goes far beyond just like what you think about as climate change that's happening with drying rivers. It's affecting humans too. And those are things that are sort of prioritized in this initial rollout of 6.5 million with the quote climate resilience hubs, which is basically intended to be a space where people could go escape their maybe smoky apartment and access air conditioning, just a safe space to go. It's unclear how quickly they'll be able to establish some of those places.
Why is it that a city run by progressives would not be on track to meet its own climate goals? I mean, you said it's expensive basically, but we knew that when it was, right. We knew it was going to be expensive. So is it just as simple as that?
I mean, I think in talking about the text messages today too, a lot has happened since 2019. This wasn't the priority. And I think, Mayor Harrell in his campaign was really critical of former Mayor Durkin not making this a priority. And that's something that now he's trying to bring to the forefront. Of course, the Green New Deal Oversight Board members are pretty critical of that, saying it's still not enough and it's too slow, too little, too late. But now it's just starting to become a semblance of a priority.
Yeah, I mean, Isabella's mentioning like replacing cars, and I think if you're going to break it down, there's not a lot of cars to buy right now.
Sure.
I mean, we're still dealing with this issue of parts that are hard to find. We're dealing with supply chain. A regular car, you could wait months. I have had friends who ordered a car last year and are just now getting their car now.
Sure.
So think about, and that's like a regular gas guzzler car. Think about an energy efficient or hybrid or an electric car. Like there's probably fewer of those cars. So yeah, if your goal, 2035 sounds like really far away, but it really isn't.
Yeah.
I was thinking about some of the goals that the state made, like were related to the environment back in like when I first moved to Washington State in like 2006, talking about, reducing emissions and like the aim was 2025 and we're now in 2022 and I'm like, oh, where did that time go? So it's not a lot of time to do all these things. And it's the same thing with like buildings. Materials are really expensive right now. They're not easily available, and so that's going to raise costs. So there's going to be people who aren't exactly incentivized to do it.
Yeah, and I think Seattle in its way is always trying to be a leader in these things as a city, and this was an attempt to do that. I mean, you remember at the state level over the past couple of years, voters have rejected carbon tax measures by and large across the state. So they'll pass them here on the west side. I mean, you'll see it in counties here, but it isn't something that the rest of the state is on board with. So I think political will is a piece of it. I think once you build up some of this consumer demand, I think that's a piece to it too. But I think you're right, Maya. It's going to take a little while, and it might take longer than 2035. But this was the city's attempt to make a step in that direction.
I mean, talking about political will in the city, I mean, just my experience with other policies where Seattle is kind of the leader. I think minimum wage comes to mind, like Seattle, CTAC, they did the $15 an hour thing really early. And then the whole state kind of came around, but only after like a very thorough like negotiation process, in Olympia during session. And then there was the voter initiative, right, that led to, the significant raise of minimum wage.
Yes.
And so I think it's the same thing. I think it's, I think Seattle's going to do it. Although I feel like minimum wage, there was a little more interest because it is people's paychecks. I don't know if there's that same interest among like regular people with like this, with cars or like this Green New Deal. Like I think in theory you could probably get there, but I don't feel like it's there yet.
It's just less tangible, right? I mean, you can see some pollution, but not all of it. You can't see, oh, wait, I'm breathing in this many chlorofluorocarbons at this moment. You don't see that. And so when people can't put their hands on it, it does make it difficult from a political perspective.
Yeah, between it not being a tangible thing and the upfront costs just being immense in a lot of cases, and especially for households that, may have never considered it. And now there's this push. I mean, after writing about these incentives for switching to heat pumps, I had quite a few people reaching out saying, even with a loan, that's not something within reach for me. And that's just a reality for people across the region.
And then you have the fact that we're part of a globe, a climate that is not restricted to Western Washington. So talk about tangible. I mean, there's the desire to be a leader on a global issue, but the actual return you're not going to get a mental health crisis facility out of it.
Yeah, no, that's the whole thing. It's like, what tangible thing can you provide me if I support this? And I think a lot of the incentives, you're right, they're substantial, but are they substantial enough? And that's where the market comes into this whole.
And I just
situation.
find with housing incentives in general, like, and not just environmental ones, just housing incentives that cities pass in hopes of generating some sort of activity. So it could be, additional residents in like downtown or something. That it's, they sell it, but like I feel like most developers don't buy it because of the cost, or it's just not. And it also with incentives, there's also a lot of requirements that come with incentives. You also have to show that you've met those requirements, and that's paperwork, and that's extra time, and that's not. And it's just easier for them just to do what they usually do instead of going out of their way to do a project that maybe has like a little bit of payoff.
I hear you, but developers are doing just fine in Seattle.
Right. No, yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, but I mean, that's the point though. If they're doing just fine, like why would they go out of their way to?
So Isabella, this is something that you cover. I'm curious what you think when politicians trumpet, what's a nicer word, when they talk up the incentives that they're giving,
perhaps.
Tout is a better word. Do they know full well that the way the market behaves and incentives that developers will bite on or won't, and supply chain, all that stuff? Do they know full well that the uptake is not going to be as wonderful as their words make it sound? Or is there kind of is there a little wink and a nod here of how progressive I am, and yet you and your colleagues have written about how the uptake on some of this stuff is not what you might think.
Sure, yeah. When I asked County Executive Constantine, what's going to come next, because clearly, the program that he's pitching to give people loans, and these would be private loans, to be able to buy heat pumps and switch out from their old fossil fueled furnaces, it was going to leave a lot of people out. And he said, this is a yes and situation. This is just to gauge people's interest, get the ball rolling on these programs. But frankly, without like real commitment and investment over the years, this is going to be insignificant. And I think that's something that a lot of the time these public officials are very aware of.
They do get stakeholders together. I will say that, and that is part of it, and that would include developers, et cetera. But there's a lot more to it than that, as you brought up.
Well, listen, let's take a short break, and since you brought up all the planes flying over Duwamish Valley, which is very
it's Segway
true.
Day. I love it.
It is Segway. It's an electric Segway. Let's talk about what flew over Washington State this week when we come back on Week in Review.
Week in Review will continue in 1 minute on 94.9 KUOW Seattle. It's 12:47, 63 degrees in Seattle with sun in this afternoon's forecast, along with a predicted high of 67.
Hey there, Seattle. It's Luke Burbank. Did you know Livewire is coming to Town Hall on November 17th? We've got a packed show featuring Ross Gay, Nora McInerney, Kenji Lopez-Alt, and music by Madison Cunningham. Head on over to kuow.org/events to get your tickets, and we'll see you there.
Support for KUOW comes from Yellowwood Academy, a 4 through 12 nonprofit school on Mercer Island, offering one-to-one and small group classes designed for each student. Hosting open houses on October 5th and November 9th at 5 p.m. Learn more at yellowwoodacademy.org.
KUOW's Week in Review this week is Crosscut's My Hoang, the Seattle Times Isabella Breda, and Seattle Channel's Brian Callanan. And I'm Bill Radke. Electric vehicle history was made this week in Washington State. An electric airplane named Alice, assembled in Snohomish County, made its maiden flight. Do we still call them maiden flights? It's first.
If it's Alice, yeah, I guess
Yeah,
so.
well, fair enough. Okay, Alice. Out of Moses Lake. This is not the first electric aircraft, but this is a commuter plane. It's designed for commercial use to carry passengers from place to place. And KUOW's Tom Bonsu told us about the first flight of Eviation's Alice.
The eye-catching, vaguely spaceship-like electric airliner took off for the first time amid a cinematic central Washington sunrise. It had a belly full of batteries driving two propellers, one on each side of its tail. Test pilot Stephen Crane was the only person on board the 9-passenger plane for the maiden flight. He flew 2 loops around the airfield before landing after 8 minutes aloft. Crane says Alice, the electric aircraft, felt different than other planes he's flown, but says it handled beautifully.
It's a fast airplane, real sleek, very responsive, and did well.
The CEO of Eviation said this is the first radical change in aerospace propulsion technology since we went from the piston engine to the jet engine, now to the electric motor. Environment reporter Isabella Breda, how big an environmental deal is this plane?
I mean, I think it's a pretty big deal. Granted, you just have to keep in mind that this is a prototype, and this flight was a test of the prototype itself, not a passenger plane that could go to market yet.
Yeah.
Right. And I thought another interesting part, I mean, this is for short trips. They're talking 200 miles or something like that for this plane. Is that right?
Yeah. And I was seeing that it would be kind of risky to try to get it from Seattle to Yakima. And if you're thinking of commuter flights, I mean, that seems like a pretty quick trip.
You would think. And I also wanted to ask you this, Isabella. I know there's a lot of push for biofuels. The airlines have been working on that for a long time. So is that a competition with the electric plane, or how does that sort out?
Not that I'm aware of, but I mean, the goal of working on these electric planes would be to reduce the reliance on jet fuels, which are becoming increasingly expensive, and that's going to harm the smaller municipal airports first.
Yeah. So I actually am somewhat familiar with this concept because I wrote a story a couple of years ago. WSDOT's been looking into this for a couple of years now.
That's the state transportation.
Yes, the Washington State Department of Transportation. Yes, and they actually did a feasibility study. They looked at some test markets. Actually, the Yakima Airport was a test market they were considering to test out these planes. Eventually, Moses Lake was also one. So that's so not surprising that they did the flight in Moses Lake. We're really far away from reality. Actually commercially viable. As Isabel said, they're testing out the concept. There's a lot of potential, and being based in Yakima, we've lost air service because of jet fuel. Like, we've had airlines pull out because the jet fuel, for the cost of fuel to do that flight, was way too expensive. So
So besides biofuels, the big sticking point is that we need batteries that are lighter and more efficient to compete with jet fuel, right?
Right.
And until biofuels come along and can compete.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, because it's, again, part of this green movement too. These are no emission planes, and so that figures into this as well. So I'm interested to see how this plays out. I know it's going to take a while, but I was really digging on the fact that it was Alice based on Alice in Wonderland, or Go Ask Alice by Jefferson Airplane. Which,
wait a minute!
Check it out. Yeah,
I did not put that together.
That's what the CEO was saying. I was like, okay, remember what the Dormouse said. Let's figure this out, man. Right, exactly.
Okay, so maybe 2027 there could be a customer delivery. I don't know. We'll see about that. Okay. How many segues is too much? Because we just talked about a short hop. Do you think there's one more in
Do it. Take us home.
You see, Crosscut, Central and Eastern Washington reporter, My Hoang. I went apple picking last weekend with my family in Wenatchee, but we didn't pick hops. And it's hop harvesting season. And there's nothing like reaching out and picking a fresh hop and eating it right there, warmed by the sun, the hop juice running down your neck.
Gosh.
To people around the world, hops come from your town, your area.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, it's hop season, and we actually grow. It's a rough estimate, but generally 70 to 75% of the U.S. hop supply, and our hops are sent
70 to 75%. That's
a lot of hops.
Yeah. So, and pretty much beyond that, Oregon and Idaho. So the Northwest grows, I would say, pretty much like 90%, like between the 3 states of U.S. hops. And yep, they're sent all around the country and all around the world. So right now, there's a lot of like breweries in Yakima right now. Actually, my husband and I, our anniversary was on Monday, and
happy anniversary.
Yes,
great.
So we made plans on other things, but we didn't make dinner reservations. And so we're like, oh, it's a Monday, it'll be fine because the restaurants will be dead. And then we went to one of the restaurants, and so literally like all these beer people, it's like the restaurant's like booked, and the lady's like, yeah, we're not gonna be able to seat you till like 9:30. It's like, well, I guess that's not happening. So yeah, I mean,
it's the beer people.
It's the beer people. Yeah, it's a big so I think for those who aren't familiar, so unlike other products, breweries actually contract hops like years in advance. So they'll go to the Yakima Valley, they'll go to a hop field, and then they'll look and say, hey, I want this many hops for like these next few years. And so they lock them down. I mean, you can still get hops on the spot market, but it's more ideal to get it in advance.
So you literally could short hops.
Oh gosh. Had to be
man.
said. Had to be said.
Sorry.
Maybe
So,
it is.
Yeah.
What you all maybe have questions too. I wondered, what about like you were telling us the cherry crop got nailed by the weather. How come? But the hop crop is good. We have good hop crop.
Yeah, actually, we're looking at. I think they were saying potentially the second highest hop crop ever. So, so the key difference is the timing of the weather. So cherries, basically every worst like nightmare of weather happened with cherries. So in the spring we had snow and cold during pollination, and pollination is very important for cherry growth. And then during the start of the harvest, we had lots of rain in the valley, which is kind of unusual, but we had it. And so when cherries are developed to a certain point, if you have too much rain, that damages the cherries, so you can't sell them. But with hops, I mean, hops was somewhat impacted with the cold weather in the spring. I mean, that's when they kind of string. So for those who don't know much about, you string these hops on, you install these strings, and then the hops kind of spiral up, so that's called a hop vine. So
hop, not hop vine as like the Seattle bar.
No, hop vine with a B.
Vine,
yes. And so, so basically by the time the hops were starting to grow, the weather was pretty good. It was fairly warm, not too hot like last year,
right?
But warm enough for it to develop. So that's the difference.
And,
cool.
And I'm a huge fresh hop guy. I wasn't at that place on Monday in Yakima, but I definitely was at one in Seattle. And when the fresh hops come out, it is a celebration just as good as Christmas. It's really good stuff when the breweries start making the good stuff with the fresh hops. It tastes great.
So there's
like the first Beaujolais.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So for those that aren't familiar with like fresh hops, so it's fresh hop or wet hop. So usually with beers are made from hops that are dried. And fresh hop, it's harvested and then it's called, and sometimes it's called wet hops because there's a lot of moisture in those hops, and then and then obviously during drying it, a lot of that moisture goes away. So instead of drying them, you just make beer with the fresh hops. So
awesome. You can taste it, you can smell it on the beer a lot more. I just think great time of year for a good brew, and thankfully we have an embarrassment of awesome breweries around Seattle. So I'm in for the win.
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah. And then you should consider coming to Yakima. I think next week is the Fresh Hop
Road
Ale
trip.
Festival.
Isabella and I are there.
Yeah.
Let's go.
All right. That's good. That's good autumn stuff. Is there anything else left to smile about? What else? We always want to end the show on something that's making you happy, hopeful.
I'm smiling big under this mask for the Mariners tonight to seal the deal on going to the playoffs for the first time in 21 years, a playoff drought that is old enough to drink fresh hop beer, if I may segue again. But it's been terrifying to watch this team over the past couple of weeks, but I think they might pull it out. It's been awesome to see.
I don't want to jinx it.
I know,
I'm not gonna
right,
say
right.
anything else.
Yeah.
All right. I would just say NASA smashed an asteroid. Our planet is safe now.
Yeah.
Too late for the dinosaurs. And Canada dropped its requirement that you register an app before you show up at the border. So I won't have to hold up the line like I did in August. And you can get there on Amtrak again. First time since the pandemic started. KUOW reporter Casey Martin spoke to a King Street station passenger named Titi Kagume.
Very, very excited. It's such a pleasure to have it running back.
Kagume lives in Paul River, British Columbia, and has been taking the bus back and forth for the past few years. She says nothing compares to the train ride that hugs the coast all the way up to Canada.
Being so close to the water and looking at the marine traffic, that is very exciting.
Yeah. Daily round trips now from Seattle to Vancouver.
Awesome.
Done? Any more things? We got a minute, 53 seconds left in the show.
I'm actually happy to meet you, like in person.
Yeah.
Making me smile too. I didn't know you were smiling.
Yeah, I mean, it's I've been on the show like a couple times over the last year, but never been in the studio, so it's exciting.
Oh, don't be surprised. Bill is a great person to meet. Don't you think? Big smiles all around.
Big
It's great to be back in the studio. This is awesome.
It's great. Thank you, Maya. That's really nice of you, and it's great to be with you in person. Yeah. And you too, Isabella Breda from the Seattle Times. And you too, Brian Callanan from the Seattle Channel. Maya's here with Crosscut, and we come together and make Week in Review. Thank you for listening. Thank you to Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu for social media and live streaming support. Thank you to Bernard Ouellet running the board, making us sound great. And the program is produced by Kevin Kniestedt. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for listening. I'm Bill Radke. We're out of time, so we'll see you next